In June of 1896, 57-year-old Amelia Dyer was executed for the murder of a baby girl. The exact number of the infants she killed is not known, but some expert reports indicate between 300 and 400 over the course of nearly 30 years. But how did a superficially respectable person ended up becoming one of England's most prolific serial killers of all time? This is the story of Amelia Dyer, perhaps the most notorious baby farmers of all time. If you enjoy content like this, please consider subscribing to my channel. And if you enjoy the video, please hit the like button to help me produce more videos like this one. Let's get into our story. In either 1837 or 1838, Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, the youngest of 5 children, was born to parents Samuel and Sarah Hopley. They were living in a small village near Bristol in England, with her father working as a master shoemaker, offering his family a comfortable life. Amelia reportedly suffered a tough upbringing, as she was the main carer of her mother. Her mother became mentally ill after contracting typhus fever, where Amelia had to endure her mother's violent outbursts and beatings. Some reports indicate that these conditions could have been a catalyst for her later actions, but that definitely does not excuse anything. When both her parents died, she went to live with her aunt at the age of 10. It is not understood how, but it was reported that she became estranged from her remaining family and had to financially support herself. From her teenage years, she was working as a corset maker. That was until 1861, when at the age of 24, she got married to her first husband, a wealthy man named George Thomas, who was 35 years her senior, and they both moved to Bristol, where she gave birth to her first daughter, Ellen. When her husband died 5 years later, she married William Dyer and had at least 2 more children, Mary Ann in 1873 and William Samuel in 1876. 2 years into her first marriage, Amelia started training to become a nurse and a midwife. It was during that time she met a midwife called Ellen Dane, who was also a baby farmer. Amelia immediately saw a lucrative opportunity in the business of baby farming that could provide her with more financial comfort. But that would only be the beginning of an evil baby serial killer. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 that was applied in England meant that unmarried single mothers were faced with no financial support from the child's father and could only be provided with food and clothing under the conditions that they would live and work in the workhouse. The horrific conditions they were faced within the workhouse and the social stigma that was attached to them as unmarried women were unbearable for the mothers. Unmarried mothers opting out of the workhouse option usually worked in houses as live-in servants, but they did not have the option to have their child living with them. So many mothers took baby farming as their only way out, a process that was quick, without many questions asked. This entailed children to be left in the care of so-called baby farmers, who, for a certain weekly amount, would care for the baby whilst the mother worked. It was pretty much like a foster care arrangement, and most of the time the baby farmers would place the babies in new homes under loving care. Sometimes they would return the babies to the mothers once they were more financially stable. Later on, many baby farmers started asking a much larger fee up front. Those who asked for a lump sum sometimes used the term adoption to justify their demands and clarify their relationship to the babies. Since adoption was completely unregulated during that era, this informal setup came under no scrutiny. In theory, baby farming seemed like a good option. It allowed desperate mothers to work to make ends meet, whilst their children were under the care of someone in a country home. But the truth of it all was far more disturbing than that. Even the best nursing baby farmers had children dying under their care, especially under the combination of epidemic diseases and unsanitary conditions. But some opportunistic monsters were offering far more cruel living conditions for the poor children placed under their care. They would opt to take in far more children than they could handle to increase their income, whilst trying to save up in the cost of caring by inadequately feeding them or neglecting them, and some, like Amelia, resorted in far worse actions than that. They would brutally murder them for personal financial gain. After the death of her first husband, Amelia started operating her business in her home as a carer for illegitimate expecting mothers who were shunned by society. They were paying Amelia a fee to live there until they gave birth. Many of the mothers would then leave their children at the hands of Amelia, again in an exchange for a fee, under the ruse that she would care for them or find a loving home for them. But alas, Amelia found a quicker way to increase her profits by killing the children. She would also either search for ads placed by mothers who were seeking baby farmers or someone to adopt their children, or she would place ads like this one herself, pretending she was in a loving relationship and could not have any children, but was desperately looking for a child to love and care for. In sociopathic-like behaviors, Amelia would come across as a very convincing, expressive, and very believable. She always assured the mothers that she would provide a caring and loving home for their babies. Amelia also built up a good enough reputation of herself, so when poor single mothers would see placed ads from Amelia, they would respond. With a signed letter and a large fee paid up front, she would take the children. Once in her care, she would neglect the poor babies and leave them to starve to death. What is even worse is that to quiet the children who were screaming from starvation, she would give them Godfrey's cordial, also known as Mother's Friend, a laced syrup to silence them through sedation. To speed up the whole process and save up more on costs, and perhaps for her own convenience, she would then change tactics, where soon after a baby was placed in her care, she would strangle them using a white tape, just to increase her profits and save up on costs. What a monster. With high infant mortality rates being a sad fact of Victorian life, these early deaths often escaped the notice of authorities. And if the mothers who wished to reclaim or check the welfare of their children were faced with no responses from Amelia, it would make them suspicious. But most of them were too frightened or ashamed to resort to police due to the tremendous judgment and wet mothers faced. In 1879, a doctor became suspicious by the large number of infant deaths occurring in Amelia's baby farm and alerted the authorities, but she was erroneously only charged with negligence and sentenced to 6 months of labor in prison. Although the experience left her with increased mental issues, once free of her labor duties, she resumed to baby farming and murder. With the increasing attention she was facing, she and her family were constantly moving, and she was operating the baby farming business under different aliases. But she also stopped informing doctors to collect the bodies. She instead started disposing of the bodies herself to avoid any attention drawn to her. After murdering them, she was placing them into cardboard boxes and throwing the poor children into the River Thames. Most babies left in her care were murdered within days, or in some cases within hours, after being left by their mom. And Amelia was collecting a fee from naive mothers between 10 and 80 pounds, a large amount for those days. If any suspicion was drawn on her, she used the mental illness as an excuse to elude authorities by starting to act insane, and even committed herself in asylums on several occasions. On March 30th, 1896, a bargeman made a gruesome discovery. He found a package where inside lay the small decomposing body of a baby girl, later identified as Helena Fry. Detective Constable Anderson made a breakthrough discovery when he examined the wrapping paper the body was wrapped in under a microscope. He identified a faintly written name and address. The name was Mrs. Thomas, and the address 26 Bigots Road, Dyer's former address. The detective eventually tracked Amelia down in her house in Reading. All evidence they gathered from witnesses made them understand the evil and disturbing activities Dyer was operating under. They realized she would flee if she suspected they were onto her, and so they sent a young woman undercover, posing as a mother interested in her services. The woman arranged an appointment on April 3, 1896, and police showed up instead to arrest her. They also found a white tape that was the same one as the one they found on Helena's neck. Another sad discovery was that they found records in her home indicating that the home should be full of children, but no children were living there. 6 more bodies were recovered from the river, all found in a similar manner, wrapped in brown paper bags inside cardboard boxes, weighed down by heavy objects and with tapes around their necks. Police initially suspected that she had her family working as accomplices for her evil acts. In a written statement, she confessed her crimes and indicated that her daughter Marianne and son-in-law, who were living under the same roof at some point, were not involved in the killings and that she was acting alone. But I found some reports that state that 2 years after Amelia's execution in September 1898, a baby was found under the seat of a railway carriage at Newton Abbot in South Devon. The 3-week-old child was cold and exhausted, but thankfully alive. She was wrapped in a brown paper parcel. When the detectives followed the traces, Marianne and her husband were convicted of abandoning the child and sentenced to 2 months of hard labor. It seems that Amelia's daughter continued on her mother's terrible actions. Many reports allege that her daughter was involved in more cases, and there is a known story that accompanies that claim. In January 1896, Evelina Marmon, an unmarried 25-year-old barmaid, gave birth to a daughter she named Doris. She resorted to placing ads to find someone to take care of her child until she would be financially more able to get her back and support her. Ironically, her ad was placed right next to Amelia's ad. Amelia's alias was Miss Harding. After an initial written correspondence that took place, Amelia tried to convince Evelina that all she wanted was a child to take care and love unconditionally, and that her and her husband, whom did not exist at that time as they were separated, would love a baby girl and would provide Doris with a warm, loving home. Evelina offered to pay weekly fees for the temporary care of her daughter, but Amelia convinced her that it was okay to be paid a fee up front and that would be enough. Since Evelina was desperate, she paid the fee in advance and a week later went to meet with Amelia to give her her daughter. They met in Cheltenham, but Evelina found it hard to separate herself from her baby and accompanied Amelia and her daughter to another train station. In fact, for a whole week Evelina was a wreck. Amelia initially wrote to Evelina that all was well, but when Evelina wrote back to Amelia, she never received a reply. As it turned out, Amelia lied to Evelina that she was traveling to Reading, but instead went to the house where her daughter Marianne was living with her husband, where Amelia killed Doris. A day later, Amelia received another child, a baby boy called Harry, whom she also murdered. Some reports support that her daughter assisted her in some of the actions, such as wrapping the bodies and pawning the baby's belongings. Doris and Harris's bodies were 2 of the 6 bodies that were found after Helena Fry's body was found. Many reports state that in total they recovered 12 bodies, but authorities knew that these were only a small fraction of the actual number. On 22nd of May of 1896, she appeared at the Old Bailey for trial. The only defense and explanation the 57-year-old offered was insanity, with her stating that she was previously committed to asylums in Bristol. But prosecution fired up by arguing that such tactics were used in the past by Amelia to avoid capture, by her acting insane and admitting herself in mental hospitals. The judge deliberated for only a few minutes to find her guilty and sentenced her to death. On June 10th of that year, she was executed in Newgate Prison. Justice for the hundreds of angels was finally served. Her trial shed light to the seriousness of the issue, where unmarried mothers were essentially forced to trust the care, either permanent or transient, of their children to baby farmers. By the end of the 19th century, legislation was established to protect the children. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 and the Children's Act of 1908 gave authorities the power to investigate baby farmers. Later on, strong legislations for adoption and fostering followed. In the recent years, Detective Anderson's great-great-grandson found items retrieved from Amelia's home in his loft. That included paper packaging, string, and wide-edging tape. I have included the link for the BBC video showing the items in the description box below if you're interested. The true scale of Amelia's horrific actions has been hard to estimate. According to a BBC article, witnesses stated that there were at least 6 babies taken to her home per day, and if she operated for approximately 30 years, it is a very, very scary thought. Whilst Amelia's horrible acts were taking place, there was another notorious murderer operating in England in 1888, Jack the Ripper. Many theorists stand hard by the belief that the suspect was in fact a man. But based on the evidence and clues, some others affirm that the suspect could be in fact a woman, dubbing her as Jill the Ripper. The last known victim of Jack the Ripper, Mary Jane Kelly, does point towards this theory. Mary Jane's closest friend Caroline testified that she was 100% certain that she saw the victim hours after the murder. Detective Aberline, one of the lead investigators, however, supported that this could be another woman wearing the victim's clothes instead, and the fact that they found clothes near Mary Jane's body that did not belong to her do point to the detective's theory. Perhaps the killer wished to disguise themselves and avoid any attention drawn to them by wearing clean clothes and leaving the bloody ones at the scene. The theory that Jack the Ripper could be in fact a woman is backed up by several books that were dedicated to Jack the Ripper, where the criminologist generated a profile that fits a female suspect. William Stewart, the author of one of the first books that was published on this, pointed out that she was probably a midwife who was also performing botched abortions. The midwife theory was based on the facts that 1. The Ripper clearly had basic knowledge of anatomy based on the condition that the victims were found in. In 3 cases, the uterus was removed. 2. The fact that none of the victims were sexually assaulted. 3. There were scratches found on the victim's body believed to be derived by someone with long nails. 4. 3 ladies' boot buttons were found near one of the victims. And 5. The neat pile of clothes folded at the victim Annie Chapman's feet described as folded in a typically feminine manner. Detective Aberline, who was heavily invested in the Jack the Ripper case, was actually the first one who brought forth the possibility of the Ripper being a woman. Amelia most possibly grew a very strong resentment towards her mother and what she put her through during her childhood, so many believe this boiled up animosity towards her mother could have been also taken out to other women. As a nurse and a midwife, she would have had a good knowledge of the female anatomy. She also lived in Whitechapel at some points over the course of her confirmed killing spree. But could this baby serial killer broaden her killing spree to also be Jill the Ripper? Perhaps some were threatening to report her or reveal her evil deeds after they repeatedly asked to reclaim their baby back or check on their welfare, but were instead faced with the reality that she killed their baby? I'm not sure, but I'm very curious to see what you think about this theory. Although Amelia Dyer is known as the most prolific baby serial killer, the darker truth is that she wasn't the only baby farmer to have acted in such atrocious ways. Sadly, there were more. Until next time.